Hey, what's up guys? It's Rick with the Digital Divide, and today I want to highlight some games for the Sega Saturn that I think you should check out if you're just now getting into collecting for the console. Now, this is part 3 of a 3-part series that I put together. If you haven't watched the first 2 videos yet, go ahead and check them out. This is going to be the final video in this series where I highlight some games. So, without further ado, let's get started at number 1, which is Shining Wisdom. Now, this is a very traditional style of RPG. It has some really unique horror elements to it. It's very much in the vein of like something like Zelda, for example. It's a top-down perspective. It's more of an action RPG. The visuals don't hold up particularly well today, but it's a fun little game and worth picking up. I remember playing it when I was younger, and I had a good time with it. The next game I want to talk about is Jurassic Park: The Lost World. I really like this game, and I remember it having a really great soundtrack. So in this game, you're kind of working your way up the food chain. You start off as a tiny little dinosaur, and then eventually you work up to like a raptor, which you can see here. And then from there, you just keep going and going. And I love the variety in this. You work your way all the way up to a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And I remember when I saw this game, I thought the graphics were just astounding at the time. I think they hold up pretty well today, though. And not only do you play as dinosaurs, but there are sections of the game where you play as a human, and you have this kind of grappling hook. It kind of reminds me a lot of Bionic Commando from Capcom, where you can use it to avoid dinosaurs. And I just had a lot of fun with this when I was younger. I haven't played it recently, though, so I don't know how well it holds up, but I would recommend picking it up since it's not a particularly expensive game. The next game I want to talk about is X-Men Children of the Atom. This is another amazing two-dimensional fighter by Capcom, who produced so many great fighters for the Saturn, and this one is no exception. It is, like the others, arcade perfect, especially if you have the additional RAM expansion card for the Sega Saturn. These games are just great, and I'm so happy that they're on there. They're super colorful, the animation is incredibly fluid, and some of the most fun you can have playing a fighter on the Saturn. Cannot recommend it highly enough. The next game I want to talk about is Dark Light Conflict. This is a great space sim that came out by Electronic Arts for the Saturn. You pick your spaceship and you just fly around, getting into dogfights and exploring the galaxy. I really, really loved this game as a kid, and I think that's because there weren't too many games like this on the Saturn, flight sims to be specific. But the lack of variety is not the only reason I enjoyed it. I really, truly had a lot of fun with it. I thought the graphics were pretty impressive at the time, and the gameplay was pretty fun, so I recommend it. I don't believe this is a particularly expensive game, so worth picking up if you find it for cheap. So I don't really import Japanese Saturn stuff, but I do have a few, and Dead or Alive is one that I want to highlight. This is a really, really amazing three-dimensional fighting game. As a matter of fact, it might be my favorite 3D fighter on the Sega Saturn. It's incredibly fluid, and it runs at the Sega Saturn's higher resolution. I had a great time with this game. If you look at how it compares visually to the arcade, it is really, really close to the point where I actually prefer the way that the Saturn version looks. Great overall console port. And just an amazing port overall. The next game I want to talk about is called Galactic Attack. This game also came out in Japan, but it was called Lair Section over there. This is a really awesome top-down perspective shooter. The targeting system kind of reminds me of a two-dimensional version of something like Panzer Dragoon Saga, where you lock onto your enemies and then release, and all of the missiles go flying towards them. Just a really, really fun game with some great boss design. The game really likes to play with perspective, and it just has a really unique art style and vibe, and the gameplay, more importantly, is just really, really fun. Highly recommend this one. It's a bit harder to find stateside, but if you can find it, recommend it. The next game I want to talk about is Mortal Kombat Trilogy. I'm more of a Capcom fighter myself, but it's hard to argue that Mortal Kombat is a staple in the fighting game world. And this is a great port overall of the game. It's not perfect, but I had a lot of fun with it. All the blood and gore that you're used to is there. The animations are pretty well done, and it has some nice audio as well. Definitely recommend picking this one up if you're a fan of Mortal Kombat or fighting games in general. Next game I want to talk about is PowerSlave. Now, this game was developed by Lobotomy Software, and it was really impressive at the time visually. They were famous for creating what's called the Slave Driver engine, which is the engine that runs this game and would later go on to power the ports of both Quake and Duke Nukem 3D for the Sega Saturn. The Saturn version of this game was hands down the best version. It was better than the PlayStation version as well as the PC version. The Saturn version of this game featured much more complex map layouts and design, and featured a lot more geometry, in addition to some lighting effects that were not in any other version of the game. It was just really impressive at the time, and the fluidity here was just not something that was common on the 32-bit console era. The next game I want to talk about is Clockwork Knight. This isn't the most complex game in the world, but I remember it being one of the earliest Saturn titles that I played, and I really enjoyed it. The entire game takes place in like a toy world, like in the bedroom of a child, and it was just a novel concept at the time, and I had a lot of fun playing through this. Again, it's a simple side-scrolling 2D platformer, but it did feature some really cool boss designs, which sometimes incorporated 3D polygonal elements, and the environment did as well. But it's not for everyone, but if this is your style of game, I would definitely recommend it. There is a sequel that came out as well. The next game I want to talk about is Magic Knight Rayearth. I believe this is the last game that was ever released for the Saturn in the United States, and because of that, finding a copy is incredibly expensive. Here's one for over $700. This one sold for over $800. The one below it here sold for $1,000. So if you're looking for a US version of this game, it is very expensive. If you want to get it for cheaper, though, you can get the Japanese version if you speak the language, or if you want to deal with, finding translations. I loved this game when I played it initially. I actually owned a copy of this game back when it came out, and I really wish I would have held on to it because it's so valuable now. There was a phase when I got out of collecting, and then I got back into it. So I plan to get this eventually again, but because of how expensive it is, it's going to be a while before I can get my hands on another copy. But it's a really fun action RPG where you have a party of 3. This is based, obviously, on the anime of the same name. I never watched the anime, but the gameplay, from what I recall, was really fun. The sprite work is well animated and colorful, and I definitely recommend this one. The next game I want to talk about is Resident Evil. This is one of the last games that came out in the Saturn's lifetime, and I have to admit that visually it's not quite as nice looking as the PlayStation version, but it is still very much a solid port of the game, and I'm really happy that Saturn owners got to experience this, because unfortunately the first game is the only one in the series that received a port on the Sega Saturn. So if you can find it, it is rather pricey because of how rare it is, but it is a lot of fun. The next game I want to talk about is called Manx TT Superbike. I love racing games and I love motorcycles. I've owned several motorcycles over the years. I plan to pick up another one this summer. And Manx TT was one of my favorite racers on the Sega Saturn. This was a port of the arcade version of the same name, and visually it's super smooth, rock solid frame rate, so much fun. I can't recommend this one enough. If you like racing games, definitely pick this one up. So the last game I want to spotlight is Cotton 2. As I said earlier, I don't really import a lot of Japanese-only games for the Saturn, but this one is an absolute must. It might be one of the best, if not the best, shooter I have played on any console in my entire life. It is that good. The art design and sprite work are in a league of its own, and I happen to be a sucker for anything that is horror themed. In this game, you play as a witch, and you're flying on your broom, and it's a side-scrolling shooter, and all of the levels are like Halloween or horror-based, which is right up my alley. I just absolutely love this game. It has a huge variety of levels and creature design. You're not just shooting the same 3 or 4 creatures over and over again. It has a massive variety to it. The bosses are great as well, and it's so much fun. I can't recommend it enough. This, in my opinion, if you have a Saturn, this is an absolute must-play game. Alright guys, that's going to do it for me today. This is the final chapter in my 3-part series of recommendations for Sega Saturn games. I think I covered most of the ones that I wanted to cover. As always, thanks for watching, and leave a comment below if you have any other recommendations.